Hello, Universal People. This is another episode of John and Jackie's People's Podcast. My name is Jackie Sawicki.
And I'm John Munitz, and welcome to the People's Basics, the movement for the universal basics of income, services, and rights. Before we get into today's topic, make sure you hit the buttons to subscribe and get more of our content as we go along, and hit those like buttons so that more people can find us. It'll really help our movement grow. So, Jackie, I have to ask you, housing, that's today's topic. Obviously, there's a lot of different scenarios for where people are living in the country and different needs of housing. But fundamentally, why should people be invested in housing as such a fundamental priority that we need to be focusing on right now in America, and as a fundamental basic that all people should have?
Well, John, as most people know, food and shelter, water, those are some of the fundamental basic needs in like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We can't function, well, if we don't know where we're going to be laying our head at night. So having a safe home, a roof over your head, super important to your health and well-being and just stress levels. And why it's important, especially in this day and age, is we have a homelessness and unhoused problem in this country, and it's totally immoral. We're one of the richest countries in the planet. So how we have such a disproportionate amount of children, mothers, veterans, seniors are one of the fastest growing unhoused populations, that it's unacceptable. So we need to do something about it.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think about some of the basic things that having housing enables. One, it's having your own space where you can have things collected and know it's in a sheltered form and you can save it. It's having this peace of mind of privacy, that no one is necessarily watching you, and being freed from some level of that anxiety. It's knowing that you're freed from some of the inclement environmental factors, whether that be toxins or it being just, inclement weather like rain. It's making sure that you have better public health, as well as a means to be able to just maintain regular hygiene if you so desire. Hopefully people out there are doing that with that privilege. But that's really what it does to me. And most importantly, it's security. It's knowing that usually you have, hopefully, some space of your own where you know that no one else can hopefully come and potentially harm you. And so that's really why I think housing is such a big need. And there's a reason why we say housing and not necessarily just shelter, because housing to me has this connotation of having a space that is to yourself, rather than having to necessarily constantly be in these more shared style, or even almost like barrack style housing projects where you have to have these open spaces where a lot of people who are homeless today actively avoid, because they feel these environments are unsafe, because a lot of the people who demand these types of shelters are people who are being released from the prison system, who are lacking shelter or housing of their own. So I think that's why it has to be such a priority that we say housing and not just shelter as a guarantee for all. And so I wanted to just bring a couple of statistics of like where we are in America about home ownership and having housing versus who wants to do rentals in America, as well as even where we are in terms of just general homelessness. So in terms of housing supply, right now, our housing supply is 89.1% occupied, meaning that we have roughly 10.9% that is vacant property right now in America. Of this, we have right now a breakdown of roughly 65.8% that is home ownership, compared to 33.6% that is renter owned, which comes out to roughly 82.8 million households that are homeowner occupied and 42 million renters. And then we have roughly 2 million people who are on Section 8 housing and 1 million people who are on some form of project-based housing currently in America. Jackie, I wanted to ask you, when you're thinking of what drives homelessness in America, What are some of the things that come to your mind of things that we need to be addressing to solve this crisis?
Poverty. I mean, that's going to be one of the main ones. People generally don't choose to be unhoused. It's usually um, a lot of times just one cataclysmic, unfortunate event cascades and just leaves people in really desperate situations. So, we're always going to come back to UBI, universal or unconditional basic income, on this program because it addresses so many of the root causes of these, multiple epidemics, not just health epidemics, but unhoused epidemics as well.
Yeah.
So, universal basic income would go a long way to keeping people in their homes. Maybe stronger rights for renters and homeowners. In other countries, it's much harder to evict people. So, that conversation might be like a whole nother can of worms. But, in Texas, you have to squat for 10 years in order to, lay claim to a place. And this is what we're talking about too, is, there's a lot of vacant, unused spaces that's just not being used when there's so many unhoused and homeless people. So, that's one of the things.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, some of the kind of causes that might knock someone off the path to being able to be in a housed situation beyond poverty can include things as like mental illness, not being able to properly take care of oneself. Disability may make it hard for one to be able to economically afford to live in certain places or be able to, again, take care of oneself potentially. And there is currently a lack of services for these people in a variety of areas, from underfunding to have those supportive housing units to make sure that these people who need a helping hand are getting the help that they need. Beyond that, there's obviously things that are more, kind of, they are choices, but at the same time, they are addictions that become basically disorders in themselves. When it comes to substance abuse, in a lot of cases, that ruins people's lives and they can't take care of themselves again. That's another thing that's a big driver of homelessness. And there's, again, forms of trauma. There's, as I said, with not just mental illness, but, just having PTSD. A lot of the times we're seeing a lot of veterans who are finding themselves into these environments themselves. And I guess the last thing I'd say is sometimes it's people who are getting just kind of socially isolated from society. A lot of people who might not have as many trustworthy relationships, or who had relationships die off, or they're in very impoverished areas. Who knows what is the problem that leads them to not being able to maybe borrow some time on someone's couch or in an extra room that someone might have. Those are some of the extra factors that come to my mind in how we have to address, as kind of a community, a culture of kind of despair and social isolation that is leaving a lot of these people feeling very invisible.
Another demographic that is disproportionately unhoused are younger LGBTQ who are, ejected from their homes, and they're at higher risk for all kinds of stuff because they're not supported. I mean, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about having communal support. And, that leads to a lot of terrible things when you're not.
I think it's a basic value system of, there's going to be a lot of people in their individual lives who may find themselves lacking a support system. And as a collective society, we cannot be leaving these people behind, and that these certain basic things like housing are things that they need to kind of stabilize and rebuild a life that can have these connections and prosperity and stability. So, I have to ask, I think the biggest driver of homelessness has to be, as we were talking about at the start, it's the affordability. It's making sure that there are units that people can obtain that are affordable, truly affordable. And so I wanted to ask you, Jackie, in your opinion, what are some of the bigger drivers of housing affordability and the cost of housing in certain areas?
Well, I thought it was really interesting. This is the day after the last New York mayoral race. and they're, New York has a really huge crisis with affordable housing, and they essentially talked about houses and buildings that make contractors a lot of money are being pushed forward, but maybe those simpler, more affordable homes aren't going to bring in such a big profit, so they're not prioritized, even though they would help people. So I feel like, as someone who did live tiny for a year, um, who who doesn't want to live the conventional American dream because it's a nightmare. There are so many things we could be doing for housing that's more ecologically sustainable and more financially sustainable. Like, we just put out an article, Matthew Yeager just wrote an article this week about eco houses, ecologically friendly houses.
Mm-hmm.
So these are recycled homes using earthen materials, recycled materials. Not only could we build houses that are zero utility bills, but we'd actually be taking things out of the landfills to build them. So that's one way. Smaller homes. Americans are building bigger and bigger homes, but we're just accumulating more and more stuff.
Yeah.
But like, we're more unhappy than ever. So if stuff made us happy, we'd be the happiest people on earth. We're not. So that's another way that we can, building smaller houses, building more ecological. There's a minimum square foot requirements in a lot of neighborhoods, and that was really hard to navigate trying to live tiny. So it's one of those, that NIMBY thing, not in my backyard. Like, we all want people to have affordable housing, but when it comes to actually like building a tiny house neighborhood, and tiny houses aren't for everybody. There's a whole bunch of different ways that we could do, like mobile homes. I live in a mobile home. They're awesome. Like, they're cheaper. They're more ecological because they're like built in bulk, so you don't have a lot of waste. All kinds of stuff. But it's very much looked down upon. Before I was educated on them, I was like, I would never live in a mobile home. But yeah, look at the price tag. And so a lot of neighborhoods won't allow mobile homes to be put on, or modular homes to be put on them. So there's a lot of restrictions that I think could be lifted with very little to zero harm to the neighborhood, or the personality of the neighborhood, whatever excuses NIMBY people want to talk about. If we really want to solve these problems, we're going to have to change our minds about some things and be a little more open-minded, and kind of let down our snobby ways. And I'll be the first to admit that I had a complete perspective change moving from the suburbs to the country. So, and it's doable.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's going to vary significantly by the type of community that you're in. In some of these more high density areas, as you were explaining before, in like a New York City, or even some of these suburban areas that are still high population outside of major metropolitan areas, these are questions that we have to be asking ourselves: is how do we expand the units in these areas that have all these services built and all these jobs built? How do we allow more people into those basic kind of prosperity zones? And it's going to take a lot of effort of investing into just new supply. And you're going to raise a lot of red flags with some of these people who are these NIMBYs in certain cultural aspects of how it doesn't fit the character of the area, of the type of property being built, or how it's going to cause more, density into their schooling and provide a potentially worse one-on-one experience for the kids within that kind of schooling area, or you get environmental concerns that certain areas will bring up. There's a lot of different roadblocks that people are going to face. And then there's also the notion of making sure that this effort that is YIMBYism essentially is building the right type of supply. As you said, we have to be smart about what does housing actually cost. And if you're going to have, which we've been doing for the past, several decades, an expansion of the average housing size in terms of total square foot, roughly nearly a doubling within the past 50 years. This is something where we're going to have to say there is a price tag to extra space. And there is a price tag to a cultural shift over time to having this notion of everyone leaving the home a lot earlier. It's kind of, there's been these cultural shifts that have put a lot of extra kind of assumed cost onto younger generations, whether it be you got to go to college, and people have had a much higher rate of demanding going to college, and then they come out with all this debt, which makes it also harder to be able to afford housing. And that they say, hey, you know, you got to go outside of the house now much earlier. The rate of this has been increasing to the point where it's increased 50% in the past 50 years as well. So we need to be analyzing what is realistic consumption and demand. If we want to live these big, gaudy lifestyles, it comes with a cost. You know, that's all about what kind of American culture largely entails a lot of the times, is we love to do things big. And, you know, there comes a cost with that. And so we have to get smart about how we do things and use space more efficiently and more sustainably, as you were kind of talking about. But I think it's also going to be generally, how do you manage this kind of on a area by area basis? Because they're going to have different needs. You know, as we were just saying, urban areas are going to have a significantly different need for the type of housing that they build compared to rural areas right now. And that's just a fact. But are there any other things in terms of costs of housing that you wanted to discuss, Jackie, that you had on your mind?
I mean, that's an age-old question too, which I almost feel like a lot of people aren't going to get to answer for themselves, to rent or to buy. So we know right now as well that Wall Street is buying up all these homes at like 20% above the asking price. So it's getting harder and harder for the average American to actually buy a home. And you know, when the last crash happened, they gave, you know, banks and businesses 0% interest rates, but they hiked up interest rates for consumers because they were scared there was going to be, like, you know, bad actors in the consumers, which is.
Isn't it like a quarter owned by banks? Is that like around the right level? I'm thinking right now of how much housing, single family units are currently being owned by these financial institutions.
At least a quarter. The newest report that came out, I think it was Politico or ProPublica, either one of those. It was really shocking how much these Wall Street investment firms are buying homes, and then, you know, we're going to see we're almost already there, where like there's a renting class, like the middle class is just being like more and more minimized the more that we give these corporations and businesses and banks and financial institutions just like carte blanche to just roll over. I mean, it's really shocking that they can just buy homes, and now everybody's going to be renters. So, you know, when you own a home, you're going to be sunk for all that cost, whatever that means. Like, if there's a leak, if there's something with the foundation, the roof, anything, that's going to be. So when you talk about the cost of housing, like, you have equity, you get that value, but like, is it worth it? And it really depends on the person and like your level of comfort in investing and stuff like that, because it kind of still is a crapshoot. You just don't know what can happen. And insurance doesn't always cover everything. You know, we've been burned ourselves. Like, we had a slab leak and they're like, well, it's under the house, so it doesn't count. And they didn't pay for anything. So, when there's property taxes, it hurts owning a home. If you're in a good school district, I mean, that's one of the major things we talked about in our education series. Insurance. If you're in the HOA, those cost fees. Those cost money. Yeah, and so when we moved out to the country, we actually had to like do everything from scratch, and it's expensive just to build a driveway and get the water put in and put an electric pole up and get internet. I mean, it costs a lot of money to just live. So this is one of those things where we're making it harder and harder for people to get a roof over their head. And it's making people desperate, and we have to change the way that we incentivize building, renting, like all of it. I mean, it's just it's so unequal.
Yeah, I think we've been talking now a lot about a lot of the supply side of how housing has worked from, the type of materials and sizing of housing units that we've been building to some of the costs of things like, insurance and taxes and the fees that sometimes come with having assessments to do expansions on your property if you want to build like accessory dwelling units, the permits, the plumbing and utilities, repairs. Housing association fees, but I want to kind of focus on the demand side next.
We bought our property and then had to ask permission to put our house on our property. We had to pay to put our house onto the property that we own. So yeah, there's all kind. And in California, I've read there's some like really, really stringent permitting and licensing and all that stuff. So they really ding you like every time.
And,
so
and
owning a home is like owning a car.
Yeah, and I mean, as you just put as a point, like it's not only just units that are already in place. If we want to like have this expansion of housing to accommodate what is an expanding society, you need to be able to build new units. And so you factor in sometimes these like raw material costs is something that a lot of people have to worry is what are we going to be having as, building supply. So there's a lot of things we've been talking about on the supply side, but I wanted to now talk a little bit of like, what is causing demand? Why certain areas have more housing crisis, demands of, unaffordability than others, and just generally what dictates what are desirable areas. And so I wanted to ask, in your opinion, Jackie, what are some of those factors that you think make an area more desirable and have more people, demanding housing that might outpace the supply that they have?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to be like really dependent on the location. Before we were out in the country, we lived in the DFW Metroplex in Dallas. And so a lot of times it's like a low crime area, a good school area. You want to be close to the highway so you can hop on and be anywhere in the Metroplex. So like good transit. Sometimes in Dallas, there is a train line. So being close to the train line is cool. Yeah. Having a lot of greenery, having nature around, that's going to be a plus. Parks, stuff like that kind of goes with the schools. Affordability, if you can actually like afford to live there or not to begin with.
Otherwise, you just get priced out. Yeah, of course. You got to be able to afford living there.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really cool areas. So like culture, the age of housing. So, like it's like a car. When you're buying a house, you need to be a little aware of how old the house is and that's why you get inspections done before you buy a house. Population, like the density. Do you want to be around a lot of people or don't you? Because, and also for me, personally, like noise pollution. So we lived right like within a mile of like a giant mix master. So anywhere, like even like when it wasn't very high traffic time, you could still hear the highway. There was a airport not too far away, so it felt like constantly there was airplanes going over, and like studies show that noise pollution actually shortens lives. So just pollution in general too, because when you get in those high density, high traffic areas, there's going to be more air pollution, more noise pollution. So quality of life extends to so many things, not just, is it safe, which is a huge one. Like people want a good school district and they want to, be somewhere safe. So those are two of the main ones, but there's so many other factors. I mean, when I was looking at it, because we do farming and gardening, I was like making sure there weren't any oil derricks or gas and shale like production really close by. So not being in a toxic cesspools kind of makes your house more valuable too.
It's kind of like a little bit more than just kind of crime, even though we could kind of say maybe pollution in itself in certain circumstances should be criminal. We are basically saying these things that are kind of risk factors. And so I think that was a very good list. There's only a couple that kind of came to my mind on top of that. you got things like weather and, general natural disasters that can be happening in these areas. We're having in a era of climate change, potentially a need for certain people to be considering moving a little bit away from the coastal lines, as sea levels potentially are going to be rising in certain areas that are especially more often below sea level. And then there are things like generally, how easy is it in an area to get financing to be able to get a home? Like, are the financial institutions within an area and the local economy able to supply you potentially with a mortgage to be able to get a home in your area? Or if there is enough, capacity to provide financial assistance to developers to develop units for rental units for people to be able to live in that area. So I just think that those are some of the things that kind of influence, demand in an area. And, I think on top of that, we have to just in general, when we're considering how do we bring people into an area, you have to think about, well, what is my community in itself? And this is something that you're going to have to think about, what types of populations you want to expand to and work off your natural strengths and potentially make long-term investments if you're going to say, hey, we need to really restart this economy. We're truly dying out. So I think for each community, this factor of how do you increase demand is going to be very dependent on your specific area. Certain things, if you're an area that's definitely a lot of a more older culture, just adding things potentially for young people isn't going to necessarily be the only thing that's going to be required to bring young people in. You need to do things that kind of set like a big hub that's going to attract everyone at once, because, often what happens is communities attract like parts. It just very often happens. Young people often attract more young people. You'll have these certain pockets kind of attract certain communities. And so that's kind of what I'll have to say there. It's very tailored to each area. But, I wanted to ask you, in terms of just generally what we need to be doing to manage the total value of land and how it's being properly managed, are there any things that come to your mind of how we actually, treat the concept of land, which is basically the essence of what dictates being able to have a house, because you got to put it on something.
Right.
How do you think that relationship should work in society?
Well, I mean, that's a huge debate going on right now. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't believe that anyone should own land and that everything should be communal. And that is one camp. And, Liam O'Mara just wrote an article for us last week about public ownership of land and private ownership of the houses on top of them, which is a really cool concept. So we could be using, there's, a lot of public land, not just parks, not just like protected spaces or anything, just a lot of land that the government owns that we could be building houses on as a means to make it more affordable, because then you don't have to pay the taxes for the land. So that's one way to make it more affordable for folks. I am personally a landowner, so when I see people like, oh, guillotine for, landowners, it really gives me pause, because not everybody who owns land exploits it. FYI, just memo. We actually have left more than half of our property wilds, and we have all kinds of really awesome critters and pollinators, and we don't use any pesticides or anything like that. So in a way that it to me is more valuable, but it's not developed, so it's less valuable. So it's our perspective and the way that we view things too. It's like keeping natural beauty to me has value, but in order to make the property more valuable, really they just want to mow all the trees down and put more driveways in, so
Yeah.
It's a lot of our paradigm, the way that we're going to tackle homelessness is going to be a reimagining of what we're capable of, what is normal, what's like considered, normal. We need to just think differently because it's the 21st century. The resources are there. The houses are there. I mean, holy moly. So
Yeah. I mean,
I don't think I answered your question.
No, I think you kind of did. One of the things that I wanted to make of note is like this general concept of the ownership of the land itself. And this might be me a bit more of a social Georgist in kind of nature, where we have people like Henry George who posit the argument that the land is the thing that we should be having common ownership of. And essentially, for those that have private usage of the land, they should be paying tax back to the society for, being able to lease that out to their private usage. And so I often think about this notion of having just a land value tax that kind of applies, that can make people maybe even use land more productively. We talked so often today about like having this expansion of land and how there are all these units out there that are outpacing the total amount of homeless people. But that means that this is property that is not being properly utilized and maintained so that people can live there in an affordable manner. And so how do you get that to be a place where that happens? Well, you tax vacant land and or just unoccupied land, so that people have to actually get some turnover so it's actually being utilized in some capacity, or it pressures potentially a private landowner who has accrued a lot of properties and is not able to, have them all be financing themselves by occupying them. Sometimes that means, okay, maybe you're not the best person to be owning all this land and putting it to productive use. Maybe you should consider returning that to the public ledger and selling that for a community land trust. And so I think about very often that so many of these areas are not being properly developed on these vacant lands, and that we're having all these blighted housing units that are frankly making areas significantly less safe, because these blighted units are usually abandoned and then used for potentially drug use. And it's a lot of the places where people who are homeless, who are trying to get off the street, they will occupy. But it can often be an area where crime kind of festers, is these blighted housing units where there is no supervision and there's no responsibility for the activities of the unit because it's simply been basically abandoned. So those are some of the things that kind of comes to my mind. I think we should all have some level of ownership in our land so that we know it's being used justly for the society and not being just left to dwell in the consolidated hands of just a few unproductively using it.
It's really funny that you put it in that perspective, because the gentleman that we bought our property from, he had held it for 20 years and it was like going to be his retirement, but he never did anything with it. And his wife was sick of paying the property taxes, so she made him sell it. And so we actually turned, a lot that had been completely wild, just like let to, go to seed for 20 years. We turned it into like a living lot and now a farm and stuff, because they couldn't, the wife didn't want to pay property taxes on a piece of property they weren't even visiting or using or anything like that. So that's really funny that you said that.
It's one of the things that I find interesting, and this is to the credit I will give to socialists, sometimes there are certain things that there is an efficiency to not having it be just private ownership, where it's more communally owned and we can actually have an assessment of the land. Because you're going to have certain people who think the most productive use of a piece of parcel of land is simply holding it and doing nothing with it, and hopefully having it accrue value for some buyer later on to come purchase it from them. And so I do say this is where I actually lean more their way, and I do call myself a little bit more social Georgist, independent. We could go ideology tagging all day long, because no one fits in a proper bucket completely. But, these have been my general thoughts of like what is really driving some of the problems around housing. And I'm really looking forward to some of the points that we are going to be getting to with some of our guests in upcoming episodes on the John and Jackie podcast. We got the most recent one with Shervin Azami. I found his points about, frankly, some of the forces that are keeping us from doing these solutions that seem very common sense of how do you fix a housing market to be more efficiently allocated and just investing the $30 billion needed to end homelessness in America each year. So I'm really looking forward to expanding on some of those conversations about why aren't we doing so much of these common sense things. But Jackie, before we wrap up here and get into some of those future conversations for people to hear here on the podcast, do you have any final thoughts you want to share on housing currently in America?
Housing is a human right. We can afford it. I'm incredibly frustrated that there are programs like Housing First that is shown to have significant benefits. Utah cut their homeless population by 91%, and Housing First, which we didn't talk about yet, but I'm sure we will in the second one. It recognizes that housing is a fundamental right, that we absolutely need it as one of our most basic needs. And when we put people in houses, then guess what? They can start receiving help and treatment because they have an address. I mean, people can't get a job because they don't have an address. People can't send their kids to school because they don't have an address. The things that we make people do in order to like receive services, it's almost like it's just this twisted, perverted, like negative feedback loop. Whereas we just put people in houses, then they can get help and they can get a job and they can put their kids in school. So we need to turn that on its lid and do a positive feedback loop. And that starts with like Housing First, UBI, Medicare for all, all the things that are totally doable. Like you said, totally efficient. We would save trillions doing universal health care, but instead it always comes back to this too. Why are there so many homeless? Well, because nobody's going to make money putting poor people in houses. That's why.
And it's hard for them to vote for themselves. Think about that too. We there's so many factors about why it's important to get people back up on their feet. It's so that they have the power to even have a voice. Like it's a really hard experience if you've ever worked at these homeless shelters, trying to get people even engaged on the idea of advocacy for themselves because they're just worried on just obtaining what they need in a day-to-day basis. So I think we're going to have a great time in the next housing episode that you and I do, where we're going to be going through a lot of the different systems in the world and how our system of government kind of dictates our housing policy. We really wanted to go through today, how does the housing market itself really work and where is kind of the allocation of America today in terms of housing. But we want you all to come back on our next episode that we're going to be releasing. So to do that, we want you all to make sure that you've subscribed to the podcast. So please make sure that you are subscribed to the John and Jackie's People's Podcast, whether you're listening on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, what have you. We want to make sure that you are engaged with the network, and you can find all this content as well at our website, thepeoplesbasics.com. So please go to all these places and get connected to the community, and please leave a like or a rating so that we know how we're doing and we hear your feedback. We want to hear from you all of how we drive this movement forward. So that being said, my universal people, we hope you have a good evening out there, as well as always. We hope you stay classy out there.
Thanks, y'all.
A rose by any other name still advocates just as sweet. Rosebuds, the Hill of Roses is no more. We are now the People's Basics. In the coming months, we'll be rolling out a new website, our comic series, and rewards to help support our new startup, media, and technology venture. In the meantime, check out our new podcast, The People's Basics, with hosts Jackie Sawicki and I, Jonathan Munitz, where we'll be breaking down a different societal basic each week with our friends, colleagues, and experts. Join us, and let's get back to the universal basics. Please help us by appeasing the algorithm gods with a like, share, subscribe, and hitting that bell today. Stay basic, my friends.